moving on to video number 2, carrying on reviewing Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Edith Scheffer. So calling it, as I was saying in the previous video, calling it Asperger syndrome cleansed the diagnosis of its historical context. And now, this is quite different to what usually happens, because usually organisations research historical figures before naming a condition after them. So, for example, in case they committed bad acts, it's part of sort of ethical consideration to give the conditions alternative names, as has happened with many conditions that were originally named after Nazi-era doctors, and it's rather, the book says, how it's rather strange that this did not happen with Asperger syndrome, that it was named after Asperger, even though he had this really dubious track record, and they didn't research him, despite the fact that they knew he worked in Nazi-era Austria. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion over whether Asperger syndrome is a separate diagnosis to Kanner syndrome. And obviously Wing disagreed, Lorna Wing. She thought that both Asperger syndrome and Kanner syndrome were describing two kind of types of autism. But obviously now we've come full circle, because Asperger syndrome has now been subsumed into autism, but the debate still goes on. Personally speaking, I think that what we call autism is really a kind of massive sorting house, a kind of dumping ground, if you like, for many conditions that can all justifiably be called autism, and yet have very different trajectories, can be very different from one another, in terms of life outcomes, get precise interaction. They might share genes, but, they're going to have many different factors involved. There's likely going to be clusters of different conditions within this pot that we label as autism. So I could kind of think in a way that both Wing's position that they're part of the same thing, and the other idea that there are types, I think in a way they both have some degree of plausibility, as it were. But I do think it was probably a good idea to get rid of Asperger's, at least. I think it's a massive debate. I'm not going to go into it now. But I do have issues with Asperger syndrome anyway, in terms of my own experiences, because I do think it is quite an elitist diagnosis, and but at the same time, many people still identify with it, and that's up to them, isn't it? Because people do identify with the condition, and that's fair play to them. So it's a very personal and individual thing at the end of the day. But personally, I don't really identify as Asperger's myself, because I think, because I am I'm very disabled by my condition, and and Asperger syndrome does emphasise basically just little quirks, and being almost amazing at certain things and stuff like that, and it's kind of known as geek syndrome, and I just can't relate to it. So, but anyway, that's a topic for a whole other video, because I go up and down with it all the time, and it's a massive, complicated thing. It really is. Because then another side of the coin is that obviously I have the high verbal skills and all the rest that's often associated with Asperger's. So it's a complicated thing. My identification with it's complicated, put it that way. But I'll go into that another time. We won't talk about that now, because I want to carry on talking about this. But yeah, suffice to say, as I say, there is a lot of debate over Asperger syndrome anyway. That still goes on. Now, another interesting thing that happened in the 1990s is that professionals and parents began slotting children and youths as having low functioning, mid functioning and high functioning, which actually, as I mentioned earlier, replicates the hierarchy that Asperger laid out in his thesis. So I think having an awareness of his history is important. It's kind of, rather ironic really, that during the 1990s, that the same terms were used as were used during the Nazi period. And we do need to be aware that these functioning labels are heavily loaded. They don't just come out of nowhere. And then it goes on page 243 to say, how kids, adults labelled might bear very little resemblance to each other, either in a type of disability or personality. But the common denominator is the concept that Asperger first really described of not fitting into the social community. So really that's what autism is, at the end of the day. It's about not fitting into the social community in a crude nutshell. And that obviously it's far more complicated than that. It's got its whole, diagnostic criteria, and obviously there are other conditions that can involve not fitting into the social community. But that's kind of but all people with autism will kind of share that in common, that they're not going to fit into the social community in varying ways. And then on page 244, it talks about how at first, and I thought it was quite interesting, that at first autism was used as a descriptor, not a diagnosis of children with social challenges. So at the beginning, autism was a very quite a vague, kind of fluid concept. It didn't have a formalised criteria, really until a lot later. It didn't actually even make it into the first DSM, and I'm talking about autism, the sort of classic variety. It didn't actually make it into the DSM until I think it was about 1980. But after the Nazi takeover of Austria, Asperger, who had previously argued against applying diagnoses, introduced autism as a psychopathy. So at first it was just a descriptor. Later, Asperger kind of started to use it more as a diagnosis. And that was really to do with politics, as Austria became increasingly Nazified. Nazified, is that word? Nazified, yeah. And that's when he developed the concept of autism as like a psychological opposite of Nazism. And it talks about how in the interwar period, children were the most surveyed, regulated in history. It talks about a diagnosis regime. A diagnosis regime is when children are kind of basically diagnosed a lot more than, say, in other periods with certain conditions that reflect the societal values of the time. And it mentions the philosopher Ian Hacking. He talks about how diagnoses make up people. So definitions emerge from the interactions of doctors, patients and social forces. And there's a continual feedback loop which changes over time. And the terms of the diagnosis then influence the perceptions of diagnosed people. So it's kind of like, sort of circle. Sort of a diagnosis circle, as it were. So then, for example, the actions of a child with a certain diagnosis then might be read through the lens of that diagnosis, obscuring the uniqueness of a child, which is quite interesting. So while Asperger's definitions were fluid, his final 1944 description of autistic psychopathy lives on, and it shapes the self-image of millions to this day. So we cannot ignore the history. And there are then unanswered questions about why Asperger's idea of autism took off in the mid-1990s. How did a diagnosis born in Nazi ideals of conformity resonate with the individualistic society in the late 20th century? Edith Schaeffer suggests that the 1990s gave birth to a new diagnosis regime, where there's increased scrutiny of children. And the diagnosis of autism suggests problems, whereas Asperger suggests those with his syndrome might be productive, even superior. So again, you've got this sort of elitist hierarchy going on, and that taps into the hopes and fears of parents. It draws on the anxieties about integration in an age of increasing technology in the 90s. The increased technology, computers, things like that, preys upon the fears of detachment and dreams of skills in new times. So there's this kind of duality going on here. How on the one hand, there's these fears that technology is resulting in a generation of children who are detached from society and not truly socially connected. But at the same time, this idea that kids with Asperger's syndrome might grow up to be great scientists and be technological pioneers. And there's this elitism going on, like many parents in the 90s were really wanted to get children to be diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, not autism, because autism suggests more problems. So again, elitist hierarchy, which I thought was quite interesting, and this whole idea of a diagnosis regime where technology at once creates fears of detachment, so children are more surveyed and analysed to make sure they're not getting too detached from society, but at the same time the sort of hope that these whiz kids will come along that will kind of change the world with their amazing gifts. And that obviously leads to a whole range of stereotypes, which can be very damaging. And then it goes on to say how, on page 247, science recognises that while children with autism share characteristics, they can also have different biological causes, which to me stands to reason. It likely encompasses many different physiological conditions. Interestingly, talking about diagnosis regimes, on page 247 it talks about hysteria. Now, hysteria was a catch-all term from the 19th century and early 20th century that lumped together many different biological conditions. So female hysteria, there was actually a wide spectrum of manifestation of female hysteria. And it was all about the inability to control emotions. And that was what these women had in common at a time when women were asserting their visible roles in public life. So hysteria was a very historically specific diagnosis, again, that came out of the fears of a particular time in history, just like maybe the fears connected to technology, the hopes of fears connected to technology in the 90s led to a new diagnosis regime in terms of autism. Where autism, unlike hysteria, is a diagnosis of supposedly under-emotional boys, and obviously that was stereotype too, because it's not just boys who have autism, and obviously there are men who are over-emotional. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of like parallel there between what happened with hysteria and what happened around autism, which I thought was quite interesting. And then again, so society, us, accepts and perpetrates the labels, and we participate in their creation. So there are philosophical questions about how autism is created via narrative, which is really interesting because obviously, autism is a real condition. It's a biological condition. It's an actual lived physical condition that causes a whole range of problems. And yet at the same time, while we can't ignore its physicality and the fact this is a real condition, at the same time it is socially constructed, which, so, it's a philosophical issue as well. There are philosophical issues here as well, so, as indeed there are with all conditions really, which I thought was quite interesting and makes me, food for thought. A lot of philosophical questions. They don't have easy answers really, but it did finish on quite a philosophical note, this book. About how we use labels, what they mean, the kind of context that they come out of, diagnostic elitism, like how Asperger's is associated with great gifts and talents, whereas the diagnosis of autism, obviously this was before they got rid of Asperger's as a diagnostic category, but in the past we had these categories, a diagnosis of autism would signify more problems, and obviously that comes with all its attendant issues, because Asperger's, the actual condition, is by no means mild and can cause a whole range of disabilities in and of itself, but it's kind of, and the way functioning labels are used and all of that, it doesn't come from a vacuum. It's ideologically value loaded, and therefore we need to think hard about how we use these terms. I think that was the main message of this book, although there are of course no easy answers. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed listening to this, and and do post any comments below. I'll be interested to read them. Do please hit that notification bell. Do please subscribe if you haven't already, and do please like this video if you want to hear and see further content. Okay, so thank you for watching.